to start. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome wherever you happen to be. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. I'm Chavit Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies here at ASU. I'm Regents Professor of History and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the third and final lecture in the lecture series, Jewish Literature Beyond the Cold War, Legacies and Futures. On February 6th, Professor Brian Goodman, who organized the series, introduced us to very interesting and relatively little known authors from Czechoslovakia. Last week, that was February 13, Professor Joe Lokar discussed a novel by the Israeli author David Grossman, and he situated that novel in a genre that we know very little about, and that's prison literature. As you remember, those who attended it, it was a fascinating conversation of a novel that linked the experience of a Jewish woman in Yugoslavia under the Tito regime with her life in Israel and the tragedy and the way that the entire family, 3 generations, actually continued to live and experience that personal trauma that the original woman, as well as the protagonist, underwent. This evening, Professor Natalie Lozinski-Veach will discuss literature composed in Germany by children of Jewish immigrants who settled in Germany in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. So these, I don't know anything what she's going to tell us. It's all going to be new, but these lectures enable us to reflect on the complexity of the Jewish experience, and we should say the human experience, in which the authors and their protagonists struggle with dislocation, exile, incarceration, oppression, loss, abandonment, and of course, there's always love. So given the resurgence of antisemitism in the world, the proliferation of totalitarian regimes all over the world, and the continued struggle of Israel against its enemies, which is going on right now in the war in Gaza, it is simply impossible not to reflect on those themes and on the complexities and ambiguities of Jewish life. So I can say more about it, but since I had dental surgery yesterday, it's very hard for me to talk. So Brian will introduce Professor Lozinski-Veach. Brian, please.
Thank you, Hava, and thanks for everybody for attending, and especially those who've made it to all 3. And we're going to try to put together some further reading lists for everybody. But I'm really excited to introduce my colleague Natalie Lozinski-Veach, who we worked together on our last lecture series for Jewish Studies, but this time everything's going to be completely new for me as well. So I'll be taking notes. So Professor Lozinski-Veach is an assistant professor of German and comparative cultural studies at Arizona State University, where she is also an affiliated faculty member in the Center for Jewish Studies and a senior sustainability scholar in the College of Global Futures. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from Brown University and works in 3 languages, English, German. In her research, Dr. Lozinski-Veach asks how art and philosophy can help us live more ethical lives, not only in relation to other humans, but also with regard to other animals and the environment. Her most recent publications include Uncertain Turns, Addressing Animal Trauma, and Nature, Condensed, Reading Paul Celan, Esther Kinsky, and Theodore W. Adorno in the Anthropocene. This essay is part of a special issue titled Reading Paul Celan Today, which Lozinski-Veach co-edited together with Dr. Jason Groves, in addition to multiple papers on Celan, who I should mention with the last lecture we got in this last year in this series. She's also published on the philosophers Walter Benjamin and Theodore W. Adorno, as well as on the writer and artist Bruno Schulz, who we both share a deep interest in. Currently, she's working on a book manuscript with the very exciting working title, in my opinion, Creaturely Constellations, Animals, Literature, and Critical Thought After, in which she traces how philosophers and poets reimagine language beyond the human in order to respond to the Shoah. So I'll hand it over now and mute myself.
Thank you so much, Brian, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. Before I get started with the talk proper, I want to give you a quick contextualization how this relates to my own work. So this talk tonight is a tiny little bit different from the two previous ones in that it's actually not based on research for a publication, but instead it has come out of the preparations for a course that I'm developing at ASU. The class will be called Writing Identity, German Jewish Literature, 1800 to Today. And it will be first offered in spring 2025. And the idea behind this course is to give students a better idea of the richness of Jewish cultural production apart from the Shoah. So we do have a course on the Shoah in German here at ASU in the School of International Letters and Cultures. It is very popular. It is very important. But the idea here was to show all the other facets of German Jewish writing and critical thought, and how that plays a very, very large part in what we think of as German culture. So my talk today has two main goals. The first one, and that will actually be the second part of my talk, will be to introduce you to three authors who write today, who are all immigrated to Germany as children in the 1990s from parts of the former Soviet Union, and who are trying to navigate what it means to be German, what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Russian, or many identities that they all hold within themselves, and they do that through writing. So this introduction will be one part of my talk. But then I think more importantly, I want to give you the tools that you need to dig into the reading lists that Dr. Goodman just mentioned. Because I think that particularly for these writers, these post-Soviet writers who are now in their 30s and 40s, knowing the context is incredibly important. And so that's what I'm going to start with. So, as I said, all three of them arrived in Germany in the 1990s, and they arrived as part of a special program, and that was called the Kontingentflüchtlingsgesetz. They themselves were called Kontingentflüchtlinge, so quota refugees. And this group of people who arrived between 1991 and 2005, when this law was ended, amounts to 220,000 Jewish immigrants and their sometimes non-Jewish family members who came to Germany during that time. And the context of this law is worth mentioning because it is important to what we will be talking about. So anti-Semitism was a long-standing problem in the Soviet Union, even though it wasn't publicly acknowledged. It was something that was happening all of the time and was even state sanctioned. So there were, for instance, Jewish quotas for studying certain disciplines at university, or certain careers were foreclosed to Jews in the Soviet Union. Now, this normal anti-Semitism, people had learned to live with that. But as the system was crumbling in the 1980s, quotidian acts of violence became more and more common. And so people felt like they could no longer live their lives as they had before. And right after the German reunification, Germany saw an opportunity to extend asylum to people who were fleeing this kind of anti-Semitic persecution in their home countries. And they did that under this quota refugee legislation. The idea by the Germans at that point was twofold. On the one hand, it was another opportunity to kind of clean up their image. Especially West Germany had not done very well with dealing with the legacies of Nazism. And that whole effort, what we know now as Germany's memory politics, only started in the 1980s. And so inviting these people in allowed the Germans to kind of communicate to the world, hey, we're a different Germany now, right? And the second part of what they were trying to do was they were trying to reinvigorate the Jewish communities in Germany. So the law was supposed to give people, the people who were arriving at that time, and the opportunity to get German citizenship within 6 to 8 years. And the idea was that they would mostly join the Jewish communities, and that happened in part. So the number here in 1980 was the official members of the Jewish communities in West Germany was 30,000. Today, it's 100,000. And that is 90% quota refugees. Now, these are only the official registered members of the Jewish community. So these are mostly religious people. The estimate is that there are at least twice as many in Germany right now. The quotation that I just skipped over was from one of the novels that I will talk about today, The Smile of My Invisible Father by Dmitrij Kapitelman. And he writes in this book, quota refugees. With this item description, the ethnopolitical entrepreneur Germany opened up a new category of products. My father snagged a bargain on his existence. The Federal Republic of Germany got a discount on its past. So you can see here his tone is quite sarcastic. It is kind of a logic of exchange that is going on here. There are ulterior motives at stake, and I'll talk more about that later. But I think this quotation kind of gives a good idea of how this is perceived by the people who are now writing in Germany. So this, of course, is the memorial, the Berlin Holocaust Memorial. And I'm showing this because these people who arrived between 1991 and 2005, they did not quite fit into the image of Jews that the Germans had constructed as part of their own self-definition as repentant perpetrators. So when I said that in the 1980s, slowly Germany is starting to reckon with its crimes and its historical responsibility, that meant accepting, yes, we were not victims of the war, we were the perpetrators, right? But as many critics say, to claim an identity as a perpetrator, it is necessary to construct somebody else as the victim. And so in the 1990s, there's a very monolithic understanding of what it means to be Jewish. And these quota refugees do not fit these images. So first of all, these people who come in from the Soviet Union, they have a different collective memory than the Germans do. So if German Jews and those who still lived in Germany, and the 30,000 members of the Jewish communities, if they looked back at the Shoah as something that turned them into victims, these new these people who arrived newly, they saw themselves as victors. They had defeated the Nazis, right? So in the Soviet Union, the most important holiday was Victor Day, May 9th, which was the day that the Red Army defeated the Nazis. And there were many veterans among the quota refugees. And here you see a man dressed up with all of his medals that he received for his service during the war. And so that already, there's a discrepancy there. It doesn't fit, right? They don't see themselves as victims. They also were not necessarily religious. They did not necessarily want to join synagogues when they arrived, because under socialism, of course, religion was neither encouraged nor supported. So if at all, it was a private affair, and often people were not even familiar with Jewish traditions, even the religious ones. So I'm going to tell you more about that later. In addition to that, the more religious and more Zionist Jews had emigrated from the Soviet Union earlier, before this quota refugee law made it possible to come to Germany. And they, of course, mostly emigrated to Israel, some to the US, some to Canada. But the ones that were left by the time that this law came into place were more secular and less likely to join these congregations. So they weren't revitalizing these Jewish communities as the Germans had expected. The other note that I have here is not real refugees. And what I mean by that is that some of them were fleeing and couldn't go back, but many of them not only could, but were going back to their home countries quite frequently. And so they did not fit the normative idea of a refugee as somebody who has lost their home, right? And so Germany was also not the savior in this image. So things were not quite lining up the way that they had expected. And then finally, assimilation was difficult because of these conflicting collective memories, but also because of poverty, unemployment, anti-Slavism. I will talk more about that as well. It was hard for them to find a place in the German society at that point. So at the same time, there's another wrinkle to questions of identity for these immigrants, and that is the integration with the existing Jewish communities. I already mentioned that many of the post-Soviet migrants were not religious. So you can see a Soviet passport here, and what's underlined is the nationality that's inserted into the passport, which is Yevrey, which is Jew, right? So Jewishness was seen as a nationality, not a religion. Often there were mixed marriages, and the children of these families were not halachically Jewish. So they were patrilineal Jews, or Vaterjuden in German. And all of that caused additional problems with integration as they were arriving. For many of these authors that I will talk about later too, Jewish identity and their Russian or Eastern European identity are really entangled in important ways, especially for secular Jews, because they weren't visibly marked as Jewish in Germany. They were mostly read as Eastern European by the Germans. And so their experiences and often experiences of discrimination were shaped by that as well. So famously about Lena Gorelik's book that I will talk about later, one critic said that in Russia she was a Jew, but in Germany she was a Russian. So I think that kind of sums it up quite concisely. So today, the post-Soviet migrants who arrived as children are contributing to what has been called a new German Jewish high culture. And it's actually being compared to Jewish cultural life the way that it was before the Holocaust. But given all of the wrinkles that I just told you about, things are not super simple. So this is Maxim Bieler. He's a more conservative voice, very outspokenly Zionist, one of the most legible German Jewish voices, especially in literature. He's an author, but he's also a critic. And he often writes for newspapers and magazines. And he said in 1995 that there are only 2 countries in which, and I quote, an original autonomous Jewish literature will be produced for a long time to come, end quote. And those 2 countries are Israel and Germany. And in the same interview, he says that one should not live and write as a Jew in Germany is naturally the first and most compelling reason why precisely as a Jew in Germany one lives and writes particularly Jewishly. Now, he is alluding to the memory of the Shoah and living amongst perpetrators and the fact that neither forgetting nor assimilation will be easily possible under such circumstances. But the other element here that's very important is the question, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to live and write as a Jew in Germany? What does it mean to live and write particularly Jewishly? I mean, there are academic conversations that have gone on for years and years, thinking through what makes a Jewish literature, what identifies a Jewish literature, and so on. And so in this particular cultural context, the question is also who gets to be Jewish and according to whom. For post-Soviet migrants, Jewishness is often a so-called floating signifier. So they're kind of figuring out as they go what their Jewishness means to them. And they do that by writing. So they're constructing German Jewish identity through their books, often by deconstructing stereotypes and writing against expectations, and so destabilizing these German stereotypes about who is properly Jewish, right? So the victim narrative, especially. This is Max Czolek, who is also a very dominant Jewish voice. He is on the other end of the political spectrum from Maxim Bieler. And he's also a dramatist and a critic, but he wrote a book called De-Integrate, which has just been translated into English. And he utters the call to Jewish thinkers and writers to resist the German, what he calls theater of reconciliation. And this theater of reconciliation, according to him, wants to see Jewish writers as evidence for the fact that Germany has kind of overcome its Nazi past and is now a welcoming country to minorities. And Czolek calls on writers to resist that by taking up roles and emotions that do not neatly fit into this narrative. So to write about anger or frustration, or as we will see with Lena Gorelik, to write about shame. And so to reinscribe what Jewishness signifies today in Germany. There's also, if you're interested, there's a whole side conversation between Bieler and Czolek about whether Czolek is allowed to identify as a Jew because he's Jewish on his father's side, and it's a whole thing. So I'm happy to talk more about that. But there are also really interesting articles about this conversation. So the writers that I will be talking about today, they employ literary strategies to deintegrate in quite interesting ways. And often it's a combination of humor, fragmentation, and very conscious, purposeful identity construction. So I'm going to talk about my authors now, but I'm going to cheat a little bit because I only have 40 minutes, so I don't have enough time to talk about everything that I want to talk to you about. And so what I will do is I will give you a very quick glance at Grjasnowa, and her book is already available in English. And so hopefully you will pick up her book and read her book and then reflect on it directly. And then I will talk about Kapitelman, whose works are currently being translated. And then I will talk about a brand new book by the author Lena Gorelik, who the book just appeared in 2021, and I expect it will take a little bit of time for it to be translated, but it is also my favorite among these books. So hopefully I can spend a tiny little bit more time on her. So Grjasnowa was born in 1984 in Baku, Azerbaijan. She's an author since, I think, last year. She's also a professor at the university in Vienna, and she immigrated when she was 11 years old. Her book, here you see the English version, All Russians Love Birch Trees, was one of the first books on this topic that was published in Germany and widely read and really successful. It came out in 2012. And she has become a real household name in Germany. She is Russian Jewish. Her husband is from Syria, and they have a daughter. And so she wrote this book about her own identity, autobiographically, but since then she has actually been writing books about the human costs of conflicts in the Middle East. So this is the only book that deals with Jewish identity in the sense that we're thematizing it in this talk, but also in this series. I would recommend this book, even though sometimes there's the criticism that it's a little bit fragmented, and I'm going to tell you why. So the book is a combination of tragedy on the one hand and humor on the other hand. It is a trauma narrative, right? And as you may know from Holocaust literature, trauma narratives tend to be written in a way that is fragmentary. And that's also the case here. It's not that it's difficult to follow or that it's not engaging, but it is fragmented. And sometimes people wonder, well, why did she write it like this? She wrote it like this because the main character in the book is reeling from the trauma of the conflict in Azerbaijan, and also from the trauma of the pogroms that she experienced there. So, as I said, anti-Semitic violence was increasing all over the Soviet Union towards the end. And in the Armenian Azerbaijani conflict, the Jewish minority that lived in the area became targeted for ethnic cleansings quite violently. And this is the story of the character in the book, but it is also the story of Grjasnowa herself, who also comes to Germany at the same age as the character in the book. And the book, I'm just going to sketch what happens because, as I said, I really hope you're going to read it. Basically, she arrives in Germany. She doesn't have a language, and she doesn't feel at home there. And so she begins to excel at school. She learns not only German, but 4 other languages. She's on track for a career in the UN. She falls in love, she makes a home. And all the while, she is still haunted by her experiences in the Soviet Union. But as she is just starting to gain a foothold, just starting to feel safe, her boyfriend has an accident and dies. And so the second part of the book is her trying to start over in Israel and trying to figure out who she is apart from Germany, how her experiences have shaped her. And it's the character is sometimes very difficult to like. She is somebody who wears identities like costumes, who reacts to stereotypes by playing into them and playing with them. For instance, she uses her Jewishness whenever it's convenient. Sometimes she pretends to be Turkish, sometimes French. She has been described as a kind of a female Jewish Don Quixote figure. But at the same time, the book is criticizing how the systems that are in place are not allowing her to heal, right? And so in the end is very ambiguous. I'm not going to spoil it, but it allows for some hope, even if the character has quite a sad and emotional story. And the language of the book is very simple, very straightforward. It's not pathos laden at all. And it's sometimes actually quite funny, which makes it a really engaging, unique read. So I'm going to move on to Dmitrij Kapitelman and the book, The Smile of My Invisible Father. So Kapitelman was born in 1986 in Kyiv, Ukraine. He is a journalist, an author, and a musician, and he immigrated when he was 8 years old. This book was published in 2016. It was his first book. Since then, he has written another one, which is a follow-up to this one, which I will also include on the reading list. Now, this book is an autobiographical story that is centering on the relationship between the author's alter ego, Dima, Dmitry, Dima is short in Russian for Dmitry, and his father, Leonid. And as an adult, the narrator is trying to get to know who his father really is. After the immigration to Germany from Ukraine, he has the sense that his father has somehow disappeared, has become invisible, and that his father is sort of an observer or a passenger in his own life, that he's not a participant. And it seems that, to him at least, it seems that he can best get at his father's truth through Leonid's contradictory relationship to his Jewish identity. And so Leonid is not religious. He says he doesn't believe in anything, but whenever he watches the movie Rain Man, he very proudly announces that Dustin Hoffman is also Jewish, right? And the indication, of course, is Jewish like himself. He doesn't celebrate any holidays or follow any traditions. He doesn't keep kosher. Like famously, his favorite food is pork with pork sauce. But at the same time, he insists on being buried in a Jewish cemetery. And for the son, it seems that these contradicting aspects of the father's identity around Jewishness can clear up or can resolve if they go to Israel together. So again, we have a trip to Israel as in the previous book. And this is, of course, a story that could have very, very quickly devolved into some modeling soul searching or some shallow navel gazing, right? Kind of like a Jewish version of Eat, Pray, Love or something like that. But actually, Kapitelman, who, as I said, is a trained journalist, he writes about this without any cliches, no kitsch at all, a lot of nuance, and lots of humor. I actually laughed out loud a few times while reading this book. And the humor is, importantly, I think, not only self-deprecating, I mean, he does poke fun at himself quite frequently, but it's also peppered with very sharp critiques of particularly German society, like the one about the quota refugees that I read you earlier, but I'm going to show you a few more quotations in a little bit. The text is written in a kind of objective style without any self-pity, without any pathos. So for instance, when he writes about the bullying that he experiences in the German school where he has no friends, he writes kind of very matter-of-factly, well, you had friends in the asylum home. You did not have friends at school. At school, I was the stinking Russian and nobody wanted to speak with me. Ostensibly, this book is about the father, but really there are, of course, two protagonists here. And it's very deeply about Dima himself and his identity. Over the course of the book, the father really does come out of his shell in Israel. He does regain a little bit of his life and then brings it back to Germany with him. So it's a successful narrative in that sense. But Dima is the one who really changes. So the narrator, just like the author himself, is a quota refugee who has a Ukrainian passport and grows up in Germany. And because he arrived as a child, no longer speaks Russian as well as he would like, to his embarrassment. At the same time, he has quite a torn relationship with Germany. In part because when they come to Germany, they come to the East. And this is a part of Leipzig in Germany called Grünau, which is notorious for being just terrorized by neo-Nazis in the 90s. I mean, overall, there was an incredible amount of neo-Nazism, particularly in the East in the 1990s. But it was especially bad in Grünau. And so Kapitelman writes about, being beaten up frequently, being afraid to leave his house, and all of these very traumatizing things. And yet he does that maintaining humor, which is quite amazing. His identity issues come from this migration history, but they also connect to what I said earlier. So he is one of those non-halachically Jewish Vaterjuden, right? So his mother is from Moldavia, so only his father is Jewish. And so he feels like a false Jew. In fact, he describes himself at multiple points in the novel as der Falschjude Dmitrij K. And some of you might recognize that this is a very clear allusion to Franz Kafka's Trial, where the protagonist, of course, is Joseph K. So here we have Dmitri K. And Joseph K. stands in front of a court that he does not understand out in the real world. Dmitri, on the other hand, stands in front of his own inner court, continuously trying to navigate his own relationship with his Jewishness. And I think there's also an allusion to Kafka's own complex relationship to being Jewish. So in allusion, this is, of course, an allusion to the conversations that I mentioned earlier about who gets to be Jewish in Germany and what that means. Now, in the end of the story, he does claim his Jewish identity, but he does only so by claiming his German identity, and he only claims his German identity by engaging with Israel. It sounds complicated. It's convoluted, but it's very straightforward in the book. So at first he's very uncomfortable with with Israel, but the country grows on him pretty quickly. It's much more nuanced and diverse than he expected. The characters that he meets come from all different political orientations. They're all very, very fully realized characters. There are no stereotypes in this book. But the real conversion experience happens when he is at the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv, where he learns that he could become a citizen of Israel on the spot. And so this is the kind of leitmotif that then follows him throughout the second part of the book, where he keeps thinking, wow, you could become a citizen of this country right away. In contrast to who he is in Germany, in contrast to his lost Ukrainian national identity, Israel would take him in right away, right? And he is so enamored with this idea that he spontaneously undergoes a quick bar mitzvah on the street and experiences a brief euphoria. He calls it almost a high of identity, finally feeling Jewish enough. And this is the description. The heart, by contrast, calls for great celebrations, writes pamphlets in which it raves about redemption, security in a warm homeland. I will finally arrive, finally belong here. No migration history in parentheses, no skepticism, no inner court. Jew in Israel, period. Now, after this, he, however, experiences very quickly an identity hangover. He goes to the West Bank. He is reminded of the complex politics of the area, but more importantly, he is reminded of his own identity and his own responsibilities. He realizes that what he really wants from Israel is not citizenship, but the legitimation of his Jewish identity, of his Jewishness, that he counts as a real Jew, which is something that his father continuously denies him throughout the book until the very end. So going through all of this, in the end, he decides to apply for German citizenship under his father's Jewish name, which is Kapitelman. In Ukraine, he had his mother's last name, which was Ramashkan, and this name was supposed to protect him from antisemitism. We see that Kapitelman is the name that is on the cover, and it is an indication that the change has already happened by the time that the book is published. So that the change in identity and in name has occurred. And towards the end of the book, even his father tells him that he is more Jewish than the father himself now, even though he cannot explain why, which is quite funny. But importantly, not all of his identity questions are resolved with that. In the beginning of the book, when he reflects on his false identity and the fake identity as a Jew under the name of Dmitrij K, he's suggesting that already with his father's name, still with his father's name, he wrestles with what it means to be Jewish, especially in Germany. Also, taking German citizenship is not a simple embrace of Germanness. Instead, it means taking political responsibility for a country that is far from perfect. The book ends on the riots in 2016 in Leipzig, where right-wing extremists were violently destroying non-German businesses and just flooding the streets with violence. This is an image of the actual event. And the book reflects in the end on the frustrations and fears around these events, but also on what it means to take responsibility for a country, to try to make it better, to try to fulfill the potential that it might have, even though if it is not yet there. And so there's this insistence on plurality and difference that Czolek's idea of de-integration suggests in the end of the book. So the last book that I want to talk about is Lena Gorelik's Wer wir sind, which is published in 2021. Gorelik is the author of 11 books, has received multiple awards, and she arrived in Germany at 11 years old and was born in 1981 in St. Petersburg, Russia. Most recently, she was awarded the Heinrich Mann Prize for 2024. So you can see it will be handed out on the 27th of March. And the Heinrich Mann Prize is given out by the Akademie der Künste in Berlin. So it's very, very prestigious. Her book is an autobiographical novel about her family's emigration from Germany from St. Petersburg in 1992. And even more than Kapitelman's text, this book is autofiction. The fictional elements are in how she tells the story, not what she writes. So she's very explicit about that. Usually, even in autofiction, there's a distinction between the actual living author and the narrator of the text. But Gorelik is really, really explicit about disrupting this division. She does not want to hide behind her narrator. The chronology of the book is quite simple. It seems to be relatively easily to summarize, right? So describes the life in St. Petersburg until the narrator, her parents, and her brother and grandmother leave for Germany in 1992, then the immigration, the life in a home for asylum seekers, then the experience of being a foreigner and eventually a kind of slow arrival. But the narrative is not linear. Throughout the novel, and maybe unsurprisingly for an author from St. Petersburg, the guiding motif is water. And like the water motif that runs throughout, the narrative too moves between time and space and stories. It includes bits of Russian written in the original Cyrillic, where to kind of fill in gaps where the German language is insufficient, where it falls short. It often offers brief, almost partial glances at the inner lives of the characters. It's as if the story was kind of catching a bit of a conversation spoken at one table over at a restaurant. And at the same time, it remains really engaging, absorbing, and especially emotionally honest. So the book is about how we become who we are, where identity comes from. And for Gorelik, this means not only where we come from in a geographic sense or a cultural sense, but also our families and the stories that our families tell, the stories that we grow up with, hearing over and over again, the stories that remain unspoken, and also how these stories are told, whether they're told as stories of heroes or stories of victims. And for Gorelik, these stories are inextricable from questions of identity. And her identity shifts and moves from day to day between and through being Russian, German, and Jewish. Not quite in between, but a composite, a shifting composite of all every day. So what do I mean by that? In Russia, while they still live in Russia, Lena at first does not know that they are Jewish. She gets a hint at their Jewishness by being called a Jew by a girl in her class. And in Russian, Jew is a slur, right? And so Jewish identity is something to hide. And yet for Lena, it's also something visible, right? Others can tell that she is different because of her curly hair, they say. At the same time, even before she knows explicitly about her Jewish identity, Yiddish is a language that is in her life. So her grandmother speaks Yiddish and calls her Yiddish affectionate names and peppers in bits of Yiddish into regular conversation. Only when she comes to Germany does she start to learn about Jewish rituals. She goes to classes at the local synagogue once a week. She has a bat mitzvah. And she only then does she learn about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust even happened. And yet at the same time, the family's Jewishness is the reason why they leave Russia. So there's an incident where her father is attacked in the metro, physically attacked, that decides that they can no longer safely stay in St. Petersburg. In Germany, in contrast, she can flaunt her Jewishness as different. If in Russia she had to hide her Jewishness, in Germany it makes her exotic. It makes her interesting. It makes her special. It's her Russian identity that marks her as other, as a foreigner, as the target of bullies, as somebody whose teachers purposefully treat her badly, which is also described in Kapitelman's text, by the way. Now, all of these stories, all of these lines of narrative are captured in the image of a little antique hanging cabinet, a tiny medicine cabinet that she buys in Amsterdam for way too much money. It's a 100-year-old cabinet, and she uses it to hold mementos of her past. For instance, the letter that her uncle wrote to her before she was born, in which he predicted that she would become a poet. And from this cabinet, the stories spin out throughout the book. It's a collection of stories. It's not a linear, cohesive narrative, but she gathers her family's memories in the book, and like she gathers these objects in the cabinet. So this is the epigraph from the book, and I translated it from the German. Everyone writes as he hears, everyone hears as he breathes. As he breathes, so he writes, do not aim to please when you do. Originally, it's a quotation from a Russian song. And she said multiple times that she wrote this book for herself. So I said she had written 11 books. And this book in particular is quite different in tone. It's much more melancholy. It's much more poetic than other things that she has written. And she really wanted to write it for herself. In it, she thematizes many uncomfortable aspects of migration. The main motive is shame. She compares her immigration experience to suddenly being painted in bright orange without having made that decision. There's a shame to not being able to determine how others see you, shame over having to live in the asylum home, shame about and for her parents, who were engineers in Russia, and now in Germany. Her father works short-term temp jobs. Her mother is a cleaning lady. She feels a lot of shame for how they're treated by the authorities, how they're treated like children. Basically, in relation to bureaucracy, the roles between the children and the parents flip, and all of a sudden, the child has to speak for the parents and navigate paperwork and interviews as a translator, not only of languages, but also of cultures. And most of all, she writes about being ashamed for feeling ashamed, being ashamed of being ashamed. She also writes about the constant xenophobia, which very often centers on language, especially on the inability to pronounce words without a Russian accent. So speak proper German is seen as an entrance ticket into the society. And Lena learns German very, very quickly. Ironically, because of something that in Russia marked her as Jewish, her inability to pronounce the rolling R of the Russian language. So at the same time, learning the language alienates her from her parents. They are told to speak proper German by other adults. They're spoken to as if they were stupid. They're treated without dignity. And she tries to fit in as a child, as a teenager. So it's a counter narrative to Gorelik's first novel, which was My White Nights, Meine weißen Nächte. And as you can see from the cover, it was a humorous fictional account about successful immigration with a happy end. It was exactly the kind of story that German readers want to read, right? Lots of self-deprecating humor, kind of poking fun at herself as the inept migrant. In Who We Are, on the other hand, she writes in a very open, sometimes angry, often melancholy way. It's a form of storytelling that really fits this call to de-integrate. It tells the story of the kind of damage that this kind of migration can do to a family, how it can tear a family apart. It also tells the story of the love that nevertheless remains between Gorelik and her parents, and that she's trying to pass on to her children who are born in Germany. Writing the book in the way that she did, interweaving Russian and Yiddish with German, that too, I think, is part of de-integration. She's claiming a place in her own particular way as a writer, claiming the German language as hers, but also illustrating where Russian and German can fill each other's gaps. So the proximity between Yiddish and German, for instance, is also constantly thematized in allusion to the historical interconnectedness between language. So I believe I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop here, but maybe we can continue talking about these books during the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. So complex, my God. Okay, Brian, you're going to handle the conversation?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. And so if anybody has questions, there's a Q&A option on Zoom. So feel free to drop whatever questions you have in there, or any comments, and we can get the conversation started. I have lots of questions. I think maybe, for me, this is most interesting. I'll kick it off while people are thinking other questions, but really we'd love to get the audience involved. For me, even though my own presentation dealt largely with kind of the context of Czechoslovakia, most of my teaching at ASU is American Jewish literature, and reaching very close to the contemporary moment. And so as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about similarities and differences. Of course, there, the many of the most sort of notable contemporary American Jewish authors are a part of the sort of post-Soviet diaspora. So there are connections there historically and culturally. But I'm also thinking in terms of even earlier generations of first and second generation sort of immigrant Jewish authors, sort of canonical writers that the names we know, from, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, the sort of post-war generation. And one of the things I was noting is one of the phrases you used was sort of the idea that these writers, through their act of writing, are constructing new forms of identity. What I think is interesting for the sort of first and second generation children of immigrants that I study in the US context is often they were deconstructing their Jewish identities, right? They were kind of like taking it apart brick by brick. And I can see that dynamic also operating in some of the authors that you were talking about. So I was sort of curious how you think about that. Like, do you see these authors as sort of trying to take apart monolithic, perhaps nationalistic ideas of what it means to be German or Jewish or other forms of sort of identity markers? Or do you see them trying to like construct something kind of more hybrid or personal, maybe even on the scale of one, right, rather than in collectivities. I'm sort of curious, whether this is similar to what I see in the US or something. Maybe the constructive aspect seems interesting to me, because I'm rambling now, but maybe I'm buying time for our audience usefully.
No, I mean, I think that you're definitely onto something here. The similarities and differences are interesting, because I think so. On the one hand, there's this big component of being alienated from Jewishness, right? In Russia or in Ukraine or in Azerbaijan, where you kind of have to either hide your identity, or you're not even fully aware of it, as Gorelik was as a child, right? And I think in that regard, coming to Germany, so that's the kind of big historical irony, that all of a sudden they have the opportunity to, in some ways, to construct, because some of them don't have anything to deconstruct yet, right? So like it's even the images of Jewishness that are being imposed on them, that are being handed down to them, are not their ideas of Jewishness. And so there is a very purposeful construction going on as well, right? So like the way that Gorelik, for instance, is trying as an author, but also in her private life, to weave in Jewish traditions into her family life now, traditions that she did not really grow up with, right? It's a very interesting, one of her first books, which is not translated, but it was a book that she wrote right after she gave birth to her son. And it's basically a long letter to her son about what it could mean for him to be Jewish in Germany, right? But really, she's also working through it herself, right? As she is writing the letter, and she is writing it in this really, you can tell that now that she is a mother herself, she's thinking about, what will I pass on? What role do these traditions occupy in my understanding of myself? How do I want my children to grow up? And it's important to her. And the interesting thing is, because she is somebody who learns about this much later in life, she gets certain things wrong still, even in the book. And her German editors are not aware enough to catch the mistakes, right? Because she doesn't have a Jewish editor who could be like, oh, hey, no, this is not quite right. And so then later readers are like, oh, she confused Purim with this holiday, right? And there are mistakes, but this is something, she is almost like a self-didact, an autodidact when it comes to Jewishness, right? And so I think there is also a construction. It's just not, she doesn't want to accept what she is given. I think Kapitelman as well, right? He's like trying to learn how to do Jewish, basically. How to Jewish as a verb, I think.
This is extremely clarifying. Thank you. Yeah, this is, I think for the US authors, right, so many of them are actually emerging from deeply culturally and religiously Jewish milieus, linguistically too, like Yiddish language, literary cultures in the US transplanted. So in some sense, some of these post-war American writers are trying to escape what they feel is sort of the culture of their parents. So this seems very different in a really interesting way. So we successfully, I babbled long enough that we've got a few questions in the chat, which I'll let you take a look at and read.
Okay. Oh, I just have a thank you note, which I appreciate. Thank you so much. So our brand asks, have the books mentioned been translated into English? So the first one, yes, All Russians Love Birch Trees is available. I will include it on the list. I recommend that you read it. The second one, My Invisible Father's Smile, is currently being translated, as is his follow-up book, A Formality in Kiev. Now, both of these have sample chapters translated, which I will also include on the reading list, which you can already read. And the one from the book that I talked about is about his quick mitzvah, in which a cat also appears in a very delightful way. So Gorelik has not yet been translated, and I'm outraged at the fact that she hasn't been translated, because, as I said, 11 books. I mean, she has been writing for a while, and she has interesting stuff to say. And I'm hoping that now that she got the Heinrich Mann Award, which is a really, really big one, I'm hoping that she will be translated. If I had time and funding, I would sit and do it myself. But I will also include, so there are many other writers in this generation that have been translated. Sasha Mariana Salzman comes to mind, Vladimir Kaminer, Alina Bronsky, and I will include their books that are already translated on the reading list, and hopefully now knowing the context, you can get the most out of reading those as well. So that was kind of my master plan here. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee. It's very mysterious. Which of these authors' experiences do you relate to the most, if any? Oh, that's personal. I mean, giving a little glimpse, I think it's definitely Gorelik, because I share a very common history with her. So my family is not Jewish, but we came to Germany from Poland. My mother and I came in 89. My father was already there since 87. And we also stayed in one of those asylum homes. We shared a room with bunk beds with a Ukrainian family. And a lot of the things that she writes about, you know, as children, you learn the language and then you translate for your parents, and all of a sudden the power imbalances between you have shifted. And it's hard for the parents too, right? Because parents want to take care of their children. They want to be the protectors. And all of a sudden they have to rely. And I think this book puts it into words so beautifully, what that's like, and the tenderness and the love that is there still, even throughout these difficulties. I mean, it's a really, really beautiful book, and that's why I hope it gets translated. Okay, so David Goldstein asks, did any of the authors depict heroes in their books as part of their Jewish identity? Heroes. I mean, heroes? Probably
Or Kafka.
I mean, you know, it's actually there's not a lot of heroic narratives. I mean, Gorelik writes about Lenin in ways that are very, very funny and kind of adorable. So as a little girl, she kind of thinks that Lenin is her uncle because of a part of the way that the Russian language can be interpreted ambiguously in a common phrase. It sounds like he's her uncle, and then she thinks that grandfather rather. And so there's a kind of hero cult around Lenin that then falls apart, but not really around their Jewish identity. It is too nuanced for that. There are no heroes and there are no victims. So yeah, no heroes. The next question. Oh, Hava, do you want to go?
I'm so fascinated by that. I do have 3 questions, if it's okay to pose it now.
Yeah, go.
It seems to me from what you're saying, I mean, I'll pose it as a question. The Jews is a marker of the postmodern. this is profoundly or inherently postmodern situation, and the Jew kind of captures the essence of postmodernity, even though postmodernity is not supposed to have an essence, but this is kind of what it's about. So that's area one. Area two, the good old story of the old student. The old student are always going to have a problem in Germany, and this is such an old. It's really, there's nothing new here. Throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, Jews had to deal with it in Germany. So kind of, as much as things change, nothing changes, right? And the third question is the strength or weakness of Jewish educational institutions. So if you want to study, if you want to learn something in America, that's one of, in my view, one of the accomplishments of Jewish studies in America. How strong is it in Germany? I do have many friends there in various universities, but it may not be the same.
Yeah,
what's going on in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna start with number one, and then I was nodding along very, very harshly, as you said. Jew is a marker of the postmodern, right? As like a kind of, yeah, when I said floating signifier, right? So somebody who does not have an identity, and of course there are some tropes on stereotypes that can be attached to that, right? The notion of the wandering Jew, for instance, somebody who does not have a home and all of that. But I think this also connects nicely to Brian's question about construction and deconstruction, because I feel that by trying to explode the narrow ideas around Jewishness as victimhood that have been propagated in Germany for such a long time, there is both a plurality and a diversity of Jewishness that arises that very much fits this idea of a Jew as a marker of the postmodern, right? You no longer have Jewishness that is one single thing that can be forced into one single box. Instead, there is everything across the political spectrum, across the religious spectrum, so many nationalities, so many ethnicities. I mean, there's a huge Israeli expat community in Berlin, right? And there are lots of artists, academics doing really interesting work, really participating in the cultural life. And you cannot, and I think that's the crux, I think, of all of these stories. You cannot say, this is what it means to be a Jew in Germany in 2024. And this is why all of these writers are constructing very specifically, this is what it means to me, right? And
Which
I think
very
that
postmodern.
It's very postmodern.
And
yeah. And at the same time, there is almost a thirst for tradition in some of them as well, right? Not necessarily for religion, but for tradition and for ritual and for, that history that is attached to and that I think is a source of meaning that is deeper than the postmodern sometimes allows for or permits for, or like a kind of superficial idea of the postmodern, right? But there is meaning in that. So yeah, and that brings me to your second question. Of course, the Ostjude, of course, right? And when I mentioned anti-Slavism and anti-Semitism are twinned in the figure of the Ostjude. And it is that is the prejudice that is, I don't know if it will ever go away. I think it's really haunting these ideas of revitalization of German Jewish life. And I think it's also something that these authors, even if they don't write about it, they have it in the back of their minds, because how could you not, right? The propaganda was there for such a long time. So I think, yeah, absolutely, 100%, that's there. the strength or weakness of Jewish institutions, I think that too is complicated because there is a lot of public funding that goes into a kind of awareness of Jewish culture in Germany now. To really know to what extent it translates into proper education is difficult to tell. So I know that, for instance, in the German equivalent of the kind of high school that leads to university, the Gymnasium, you are expected to have some sort of religious or ethics formation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think most schools do not offer a Jewish educational framework, whether secular or religious in this context. So these students would have to go elsewhere. And I think mostly these institutions would then be associated with the official Jewish community, which is religiously inscribed. So I really, at the university level, I think it's different. I think there is more available, but also not the same as here. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But if people want it, they can seek it out. So Max Czolek, for instance, he studied Jewish identity in university. That was like his major, and he wrote his thesis on anti-Semitism. So, it's there. You can do it if you want to, but you have to seek it out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I answered your questions.
No, this is great. 100 years ago, in the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, there was what we call the Jewish Renaissance in Germany, right? Rosenzweig, Buber.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that what's going on right now with those authors is similar? I mean, how do those things, is there a revival going on right now in your mind in Germany?
Yes, but in a postmodern way. To tie back to your question, to your first question, right? Because to me, at least, the Jewish Renaissance of the 20s feels more cohesive.
That's right.
I mean, rereadings of Jewish religious texts through new lenses, re-engagements with Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, right? All of this, there was more of an intellectual unity there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the positions are so different that, I mean, as I mentioned, there's this conflict between Biller and Czolek about whether Czolek is even allowed to identify as Jewish, right? On the surface, that's very, it's a contentious question, but it's also, I think, a testament to the richness of different identities that are now present, and that this question is being discussed not only in Jewish publications like Buber's Der Jude, right? But it's being discussed in opinion pieces in the largest papers in the country, right? So Frankfurter Allgemeine, Die Süddeutsche, people are writing about this and are having this conversation. Biller was on German television as part of a very, very well-established team of literary critics that would be on TV every Sunday, right, discussing the newest books. And I think that the plurality of voices that is out there, that's the Renaissance now.
Okay.
And I just touched on such a small fragment of it.
Interesting. Do we have other questions?
There is one more.
Looks like we have one more. Yeah.
Yeah. So Lita Ray asks, I guess I couldn't fully hear. Before examination of the authors, I heard the year 2005, the quota laws. Yes. Was the years leading up to 2005 relating to anti-Semitism in Soviet Union, or was that in West Germany? Also, maybe because of the Vladimir Putin Tucker Carlson interviews on my mind. and therefore Dresden. But did East Germany ever have any Jewish refugee and welcoming programs? Yes, it did. It did. And actually, so the quota refugee program that ended in 2005, its very origins were in East Germany, in the GDR. So during the last final meetings of the government in the GDR, it was decided to welcome in Jewish refugees from other Soviet countries. But it was a very delicate affair, because since the GDR was an affiliate of the Soviet Union, they could not talk about anti-Semitism even existing in the Soviet Union, right? Because the Soviet Union, you couldn't criticize the Soviet Union, it was perfect. There's no anti-Semitism under socialism. And so these laws were kind of put through under kind of framed very vaguely, and allowing people who felt persecuted to come, right? But that started in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. And then after the reunification, Germany decided to continue this, because it was just such a great opportunity to clean up its image even more, right? I'm being a little sarcastic about it, because they didn't quite do right by all the people that they welcomed in, and they had expectations that were unfair to these immigrants. So
wonderful. Well, it looks like we've exhausted the chat, and this has been a wonderful series. I've learned a lot, so I appreciate Chava and Lisa for suggesting that we do this again, and hopefully we'll be invited back to do it again in the future.
Absolutely.
Who knows what the theme will be? But
We only
we'll work on
started.
a reading list, and we're always we always love hearing from all of you and talking to you. So I'm going to thank Natalie one more time, and have a very good night, and hopefully you're all excited to read some books.
Yes, indeed. And I remind, first of all, thank you both to Natalie and to Brian and to Joe, who was with us last week. It was really a very fascinating lecture series, because nobody really knows this literature. So you brought it to us and contextualized it beautifully. I will remind everybody who is still on the Zoom call that on Sunday and Monday, February 25th and 26th, we have a conference here in Phoenix. It's going to be both in person, and you can also Zoom in, on biotechnology, Judaism, and the future of humanity. And the main question is, can technology make us more human? So you received a lot of emails about it. So please register, and at least to some of the conference sessions, try to be there, either in person if you're in Phoenix, or online if you are not here in Phoenix. So thank you so much. I think it has been absolutely fascinating, and more will come also in the month of March. So good night, and thank you, everyone.